Throughout history, the moment the battle ended was supposed to be the moment of relief, the turning point between chaos and safety. But for the wounded, it was often the beginning of a slower, crueler kind of death. Surviving a war didn't make you a hero, it made you a problem. On the battlefield, if a man lost a limb, took a gut wound, or was trampled by cavalry, there was no triage system, no ambulance, no evacuation protocol. Most armies had no formal medical corps. What passed for treatment was a field tent, a dirty saw, and a prayer. If you were lucky, someone tied a cloth around your wound before you bled out. If you were unlucky, you were left where you fell, screaming, ignored, devoured by flies. And those were the ones still conscious. In many armies, soldiers who couldn't stand or walk were considered spent. They had served their purpose. Horses and carts were reserved for weapons, officers, and supplies, not for broken men. The logic was brutal. Dragging a dying soldier slowed the march, cost resources, and brought down morale. So they were left behind, piled into wagons only if there was space, buried in ditches if there wasn't. Some tried to crawl after the army. Others were found days later, delirious, gangrenous, whispering the names of dead comrades to no one. Locals avoided them, enemies finished them, nature reclaimed them, and the war moved on. Even in so-called advanced military campaigns, where medicine had made its first stumbling steps, wounded soldiers were seen less as patients and more as logistical burdens. If you couldn't return to the front, you were forgotten. If you couldn't work, you were replaced. And if you lived, but lived ruined, you were no longer useful to the machine that broke you. There were no pensions, no rehabilitation, no therapy. A man who lost a leg might be given a crutch, a coin, or a prayer. But more often, he was given nothing. He returned home, if he had one, to a society that didn't want to see him. Deformed bodies were reminders of what war actually cost. So they were hidden, or ignored, or turned into street beggars, wearing rags and medals, with stories no one wanted to hear. Because survival in war was never the end. It was the start of decay. And for the wounded, the world beyond the battlefield offered only two things: pity or silence. Neither healed. The armies that marched through history didn't just leave behind blood and ash. They left behind their wounded, not by accident, by design. Most militaries throughout the ancient, medieval, and even early modern periods were built to win wars, not to care for the aftermath. The wounded didn't fit into strategy. They didn't return value. They didn't serve a purpose beyond morale. And once their injuries made them unpresentable, even that was gone. Logistical plans rarely included space for recovery. Army budgets prioritized armor, horses, and siege engines, not bandages, food, or shelter for the broken. In fact, some commanding officers viewed high numbers of wounded as a liability, a threat to mobility, or worse, a moral drain on the fighting force. Hospitals, when they existed, were not healing centers. They were holding zones, cramped, unsanitary, and understaffed. There was no long-term care, no strategy for reintegration, no blueprint for what to do with a man who could no longer hold a weapon. And so, in many cases, policies were quietly adopted to stop helping after a certain point. Disfigurement, amputation, mental breakdowns. You were no longer a soldier. You were a ghost in uniform. Some states developed early pensions, but they were often symbolic. A coin here, a crumb there. Enough to appear generous, but never enough to live. In many regions, these pensions were tied to rank or lineage, meaning the poorest, most brutalized soldiers were excluded from even the illusion of compensation. And if a war ended badly, forget it. Victorious governments sometimes celebrated their veterans, but losing ones erased them. To acknowledge the wounded was to admit failure, and no ruler wanted that scar in the public square. So the wounded became invisible by policy. They were moved to monasteries, exiled to leper colonies, sent to poorhouses, categorized as vagrants. The military machine, so quick to command their bodies in battle, was equally quick to disown those bodies once broken. And in doing so, it created an institutional culture where survival wasn't rewarded. It was punished with neglect. Because in war, the dead were honored. The victorious were praised. But the wounded? They were left to rot in plain sight, until no one looked at all. When a war ended, the banners came down, the kings gave speeches, and the historians sharpened their quills. Victories were recorded, defeats were reframed, heroes were named, statues were commissioned, and the wounded? They were erased in ink. The stories of broken men didn't make it into the chronicles. The soldier who limped home with half a face, or the one who screamed at night from wounds no one could see, they didn't fit the narrative of glory. Their presence was inconvenient. Their pain was bad propaganda. But some tried to speak. In letters, diaries, whispered tavern confessions, the wounded told truths no general ever mentioned. They wrote of friends left bleeding in mud, of surgeries done with rusted knives, of priests offering last rites instead of care, of governments that promised medals and gave nothing. Some of these voices survived. Most didn't. Because literacy wasn't common among common soldiers. Their stories were oral, fragile, scattered, dependent on memory. And memories rot faster than statues. Even those who had the means to write were often met with disbelief or discomfort. No one wanted to hear that victory came soaked in pus and screams, that their nation's pride marched over corpses it created, that sacrifice didn't always mean martyrdom. Sometimes it meant abandonment with ceremony. And so the stories were dismissed. Too emotional, too bitter, too inconvenient. In some cases, veterans who spoke out were institutionalized. Others were mocked, labeled cowards, madmen, or drunkards. Their wounds, both physical and psychological, became evidence against their credibility. And the silence grew, until all that remained were the monuments. Cold, clean, and blind. Monuments that celebrated death, but never asked what happened to those who survived it. Because war isn't just written by the victors, it's edited by those who can't stand the sound of truth from a broken mouth. The soldier returned home, but not whole. Maybe he was missing a leg. Maybe his face no longer resembled a face. Maybe the wound wasn't visible at all. Just something behind the eyes that never quite blinked the same again. And suddenly, he didn't belong anywhere. He wasn't a hero anymore. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't even useful. He was a reminder of the blood that was spilled, of the promises that were broken, of the systems that sent him to war and left him behind. Communities that once cheered the soldier's departure now crossed the street to avoid the man who returned. Employers hesitated. Women looked away. Children stared. Neighbors whispered. He walked differently. He spoke less. He drank more. He needed help, but not the kind anyone wanted to give. In many towns, beggars with stumps and scars lined the outskirts of markets, holding out hands no one wanted to touch. They didn't just carry wounds, they carried guilt. Not their own, but society's. And society hates being reminded. Mental trauma, what today we call PTSD, was interpreted as madness, weakness, or demonic possession. Soldiers who shook, who screamed in the night, who recoiled at loud sounds were institutionalized or shunned. There was no therapy, no support, only shame. Disfigurement was even worse. In cultures obsessed with symmetry, the mutilated were treated like monsters. Not feared, but pitied to the point of invisibility. They were hidden from ceremonies, excluded from rituals, unspoken in family trees. And when they died, young, poor, forgotten, they were buried without medals. No flags, no last salute, no remembrance. Because society doesn't like unfinished stories, and wounded men are unfinished by definition. They survived, but not the way they were supposed to. And so they were treated like broken tools, useful once, now discarded, still visible, too visible. Honor in war is rarely about survival. It's about how you die. The fallen soldier becomes a symbol. He gets carved in stone, sung in anthems, placed in textbooks. His sacrifice is made clean, noble, complete. His pain is erased. His body, buried intact or not, becomes part of a narrative. But the ones who don't die, they don't fit the script. There is no ritual for the man who drags half his body for miles. No anthem for the one who wakes up screaming. No statue for the soldier who begs on the street while children throw stones. Because glory requires simplicity, and pain is messy. Throughout history, military cultures built elaborate codes of honor that glorified sacrifice, but had no language for aftermath. To die in battle was proof of courage. To survive disfigured was evidence of imperfection. And so the narrative chose one over the other. This wasn't accidental. It was institutional. Soldiers were taught to aspire to martyrdom, not recovery. Training drilled obedience, not resilience. Wounds were treated as temporary setbacks or signs of failure. To admit pain was to confess weakness. To ask for help was shameful. And to survive broken was a private burden, never a public honor. Even medals, when given, were designed for spectacle, not support. A ribbon on a chest didn't feed a family or reattach a limb. Parades were held, but hospitals were neglected. Speeches were made, but prosthetics were unaffordable. The message was clear. We honor your sacrifice, not your survival. This myth of glory wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. A culture that glorifies death is easier to recruit. A soldier who expects nothing after injury is easier to discard. And a population that sees wounded veterans as outliers is less likely to question the system that produces them. So the suffering continued, quiet, unseen, wrapped in flags that refused to shelter, surrounded by silence loud enough to drown a scream. Because in war, the ideal soldier is the one who doesn't come back. And the one who does? He's a problem to be forgotten, not a legacy to protect. The war ends. The battlefield grows quiet. The speeches are made. And the soldier, still bleeding inside, is expected to disappear. Centuries have passed. The weapons changed. The uniforms evolved. The language became clinical, professional, precise. But the silence, that stayed the same. The wounded soldier still walks into a society that doesn't know what to do with him. He still carries injuries that make others uncomfortable. He still hears phrases like, "Thank you for your service," while paperwork piles up, while care is denied, while beds remain unfunded. Because the legacy of war isn't just trauma, it's erasure. To our governments still promise lifelong support and then build bureaucracies to delay it. Veterans still sleep under bridges while monuments are polished. Soldiers are still taught that pain is personal, that therapy is weakness, that asking for help is betrayal, and history still forgets. We remember the battles, the flags, the victory days, but we rarely remember the amputees, the burn victims, the suicides. The wounded are still out there. Only now, they wear modern prosthetics. They take antidepressants. They smile in photos. They raise children and bury nightmares. And when they break, it's in private. Because the world prefers the version of war that ends in glory, not the one that limps into unemployment offices, emergency rooms, or silence. In every era, war wounds the body. But it's peace that finishes the job, by pretending those wounds no longer exist.